Hello and welcome to Octedgar Allan Poeber Part 2. If you're coming from the poetry video, welcome back. Or if this is your first video of the day and you are looking for the Edgar Allan Poe poems, that is in another video that got posted today. I learned my lesson from Part 1 and made sure to really segment out these two, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody could find what they're looking for really easily. I don't expect everybody to read every single thing that was on the list, but there are two separate videos. This will be for the short stories and the essay. The other one will be for the poems, and both of those videos will have all of the different sections time-stamped in the description below. So with that, let's get started on the short stories. Now I'm just going to put this here at the front. There was an unintentional teeth theme for the short stories this time. I don't know if any of you all noticed, but I'll kind of point those out as we go. And that does lead into the first story we have today. First up, we're looking at the facts in the case of M. Valdemar, which was first published in 1845, and at first, some people actually thought that this was a true story. This is a very interesting story of the narrator experimenting with mesmerizing Valdemar, who is on the brink of death here, and he essentially is freezing him in a state between sleep and wakefulness, and he just wants to see what'll happen here. I first mentioned this briefly in the Murders in the Rue Morgue video from the Part 1 short stories video, but Poe's knowledge is again on display here. He had really detailed descriptions of human anatomy, and the teeth especially. There is a line once Valdemar is already in this state of suspension between sleep and wakefulness, where he describes his lips writhing about the teeth, but he does describe a lot of other body parts, and it just makes you feel the impression that he does have some experience with studying anatomy. So once Valdemar is in this state, his consciousness never dies, but his body really starts to. Once the trance is broken after months in this state, his body starts to break down completely, and it's described as a nearly liquid mass, which is surprisingly graphic here. One analysis that talks about the breakdown of Valdemar's name was actually pretty funny. If you know some Spanish, Del Mar is actually of the sea, and so when you look at this, it could almost be interpreted as Valley of the Sea, which is a good balance between solid and liquid, just like his body was at the end. That's pretty clever, Poe. So we talked in Part 1 about this ever-present quote about Poe saying that the death of a beautiful woman is one of the most poetical things in the world, but not here. This is not with a woman, this is actually with a man, and his death is not poetical, it is not beautiful, it's actually pretty disgusting, and I think that it's funny that we really start to see that difference as we get deeper into each of these short stories. The story wasn't traditionally scary, it was more pretty gory, and I enjoyed it overall for what it was, and of course we had to get the teeth in there somewhere. Next we had The Imp of the Perverse, which was published in 1845, and is actually the only short story here that's teeth-free. One of my first thoughts upon reading this story was that it was actually starting to sound like an essay, and I was getting worried that I actually put it in the wrong category because my copy of the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe actually puts these short stories and the essay together, and so I was getting worried about that, but I learned that that was by design. This story actually did start out as an essay and was supposed to look at the theory of the Imp of the Perverse without getting into any fictional territory, but that theory is basically looking into humans' self-destructive tendencies, which is a pretty interesting idea. Obviously, this can lead to poor decisions, and in the case of the narrator, this is absolutely true. He kills a man with a toxic candle because he knows that that man stays in a room that is not well ventilated, and once that man dies, the narrator actually inherits all of his fortune. He's living pretty well for a while, but he starts to think about confessing, and it's against his self-interest, which really plays into this theory, and because of that, it starts to really circle in his head over and over and over, and as he goes farther along on his walk, he then confesses that he committed this crime and is immediately arrested. He's tried and convicted of murder and is sentenced to a death by hanging, which is actually pretty nice because some murderers in Poe's stories actually get away with it, so to see him actually get his justice is good. Poe took a very creative approach to this story, and I really liked it in the end because of that. Even though I was kind of confused at the beginning, I started to tune into what was going on, and it became very enjoyable overall. Apparently, this format was also used in The Premature Burial, so if you liked this style, that would be the one to check out next, and I think I will definitely be doing that as well. Moving down the list, we had Hop Frog, which was published in 1849 and was probably the most sinister story that I read this week. Hop Frog also had multiple instances where he got really riled up and grinded his teeth, which again plays into that teeth theme that was totally unintentional. This story details a king prone to pranking people, his cabinet, and two dwarfs that were taken from their respective countries during royal military campaigns. One of the dwarfs is called Hop Frog for his stunted stance and his interesting walk, and the other one is a beautiful woman called Tripetta. The two dwarfs are friends through their mutual adversity, which really sets the climax in motion. The king is looking to have some fun, so he starts to force feed Hop Frog wine because he knows that Hop Frog can't handle his liquor very well. And so Tripetta, because they're friends, comes to Hop Frog's rescue, and when she does, the king actually hits her, pushes her aside, throws a goblet at her face, and this really changes Hop Frog's demeanor at that point. Hop Frog plays into the king's tendencies and really tricks him, being like, oh, I have this great prank for the rest of the party that's going on outside because there's a masquerade that's happening that evening, and Hop Frog just puts on a bunch of tar on the king and his men, as well as other flammable material, puts chains on them and says, oh, you'll look like orangutans, but obviously he has something else in mind. So things start to get out of control as Hop Frog leads the king and his men into the party to freak everybody out. He puts the chain that they're all on this chandelier hook that he had taken down, and he gets them lifted up into the air. And it was described earlier on in the story that Hop Frog had really strong arms, so he was able to climb around, and he had a torch and just lit them on fire. I think this was one of the only times this week that I actually made a face as I was reading this, because I was so shocked that everyone was going to be locked in this room as the king was set on fire, as well as the rest of his men. Nobody could help. Hop Frog was just up there knowing that everything that he was doing was going according to plan, which is just nuts. And so I think that made it more shocking because it was the king. And I know that that's not something that should make a difference, but for that time, especially after reading a lot of Shakespeare's plays where everybody has such reverence for the king, anything that happens to the king in that moment is going to cause trouble for not only the immediate family, but for the entire kingdom as well. And so for him to just light them on fire and dip out of there, I thought that was pretty nuts. There were some theories online that tied some plot points of Hop Frog to some periods of Edgar's life, and let me just detail a few of those here. I don't know that they're true, but there seems to be some feasibility here. First of all, you have Hop Frog getting taken from his country and put under the control of this wealthy person, the king, and some people tied that to Edgar getting taken from his original birthplace because his mom had died and his dad had run away. He had gotten taken away by John Allan and was put under control of somebody that he really had a contentious relationship with. Then you have Hop Frog's drinking, which really does tie into Edgar Allan Poe because it was shown in a lot of different stories on Edgar's life that he did have a problem with alcohol, and he had people that did try to force it on him, and he never liked that because, again, I don't know how true this is, but he always had the feeling that he was able to get inebriated a lot more easily than other people. Whether or not those various things are true, this story was still very sinister and, again, did elicit a reaction out of me. And so for that, I did enjoy it because it was able to do that, but man, I hope I never see that in my lifetime. Lastly, we had Bernice, which was first published in 1835, and as opposed to Hop Frog, which was the most sinister story of the week, this had to take the cake for the most terrifying. The teeth theme really comes to the forefront on this one. In fact, it is the main point of the entire short story. The narrator has monomania where he becomes fixated on particular things, and one day after Bernice smiles, his fixation is totally focused on her teeth. He drifts in and out of awareness because of this fixation, and during his brief periods of lucidity, he finds out that Bernice supposedly died. We get to the end of the story, and one of the servants says that Bernice's grave was actually disturbed. There's a shrouded figure that is still alive. They think it's Bernice, and he starts to panic because he looks around his desk and there's some damning evidence there. His clothes are covered in blood and mud. He has a shovel near him. There's a poem detailing visiting the grave of my beloved, and he has a box that crashes to the ground that spills out dental instruments and, surprise, surprise, 32 small white-looking ivory substances. I wonder what that is. We have to deduce that Bernice was buried alive at one point. We also have to realize that her teeth were pulled out while she was still alive, and that's a lot of traumatic stuff to go through while you're still alive. I'm telling you, this was the most terrifying story of the week, and if you look at the history of this story, people actually complained about it when it got published because of all of the violence that wasn't all technically there. And there was an edited version that had to come out in 1840, 5 years later. Poe argued against this censorship, but obviously complied in the end. He knew that this was in bad taste, but he said that all of the other publications that were out there at the time were really making their name off of stories like this, and so he knew he had to push the boundary to find that success. He didn't want the public perception to be the measure of success for this story. He wanted it to be the sales, which is a pretty business-savvy way to look at it, because if there is a story that's getting a reputation of being obscene and very violent, people probably would buy it to see what all the fuss is about, and so you would get a lot of great sales. I don't know if he thought farther ahead than that, if people really wanted to blacklist him because of stories like this. I don't know, but it must have worked out for him because he was a successful writer in his time and people did know his name, so maybe he had a point here. But this story was a fascinating look at mental illness. I know we have a couple more stories in part 3 that look at that as well, but it was just so crazy because the narrator knew that he did something wrong after he had gotten back into a lucid state, but he didn't know what it was. And it was just really sad too, because personally he was a great guy. He was a smart individual, and they wanted to nail that point home by pointing out that he was born in a library at the beginning, but he just didn't know what he was doing when he was in these states where he was succumbing to this monomania, and that made it sad and, again, very terrifying. Because of all those factors, this was probably one of the best of the bunch so far. Lastly, we are getting into the essay. This time around, we're looking at Maelzel's Chess Player, which was published in 1836, 5 years before The Murders of the Rue Morgue, which was published in 1841. Now you're wondering why I may bring that up. It's because here Poe is taking on a real-life detective role, which could have had an impact on his writing for the fictional side of things later on. Basically, he was trying to prove that this chess-playing robot called the Turk was not actually a full robot. There was somebody that was assisting in a lot of the functions for it to be able to work, and so he brought in a lot of other observations from other different sources and then laid out a whole numbered list at the end himself. Many of his hypotheses were wrong in this case, but some of them were right, so Detective Poe might have had a good start here. So I read something interesting after I finished this essay. This piece actually caused quite a stir at the time of its release, and it elicited responses from the Norfolk Herald, the Baltimore Gazette, the Baltimore Patriot, the United States Gazette, the Charleston Courier, the Winchester Virginian, and the New Yorker. I just keep being surprised by the recognition Poe had in his lifetime. A lot of great writers don't get recognition until they've died, but here, obviously, he was well known enough to have people respond to him. A lot of his other poems were successes right away. I just think that it's so interesting that a piece like this caused so much of a stir that all these people responded, but that just shows that Poe was a great writer, not only for us now, but for his time as well. I loved hearing about the robots of this time. It's just so fun to read about technology because technology seems to age a lot faster than other things because of the fact that it's grown exponentially over time, but also it was just really fun to read a piece of investigative journalism from the 1800s. I organized this read-along to have the most substantial pieces last, and that includes the essay. We'll be looking at one called The Poetic Principle, so that will be a bit more serious, but I hope you all had fun with these first two essays. I just wanted to have some lighthearted pieces for us to get into Edgar Allan Poe's nonfiction writing style, and so hopefully we'll have some pretty deep discussions for that next week, and we'll also be looking at some heavyweights in The Fall of the House of Usher, The Telltale Heart, and The Raven as well. If you're still looking for the poem discussions, those are in another video that got posted today for Octedgar Allan Poeber, or if this is the end of the line for you, I will also be uploading a ShakeTube video today, so you're seeing a lot of Brian's book bashing today. I'm looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts in the comments below, and I hope you'll join me on the 30th for part 3 of Octedgar Allan Poeber. Until then, have a great weekend. I'll catch you next time.